Last Friday, Roy, Cal, and Taylor previewed the competitive balance changes that we can expect in the upcoming patch on the 28th of November. And while this patch doesn't currently look like it's going to dramatically alter the meta, I think there are some interesting changes in this preview that we got, so I thought I'd make a video on it. Before we get into any specific changes, I just want to caveat that this is a preview of the eventual balance patch that will come later in November, and none of these proposed changes are currently on live servers. In fact, some of these changes may never make it to live servers, and there may be updates in that eventual patch that weren't included here. It's fun to speculate in theorycraft, but let's make sure that we take this preview with a grain of salt. The video is broken up into chapters, and I'd encourage you to use the chapter markers if there's a specific topic that you want to hear more about. We're going to start with changes to support professions, touch on a handful of damage profession changes, discuss changes to existing relics and previews of new relics, before ending the video with a few predictions about how these changes may impact the world versus world meta. So with all that said, let's get started. In previous videos on the channel, and on Twitch, I've mentioned that recent changes to Chronomancer suggest that ArenaNet wants it to fill a primary support role in parties as an alternative to Firebrand, a profession that can provide high-value defensive boons like Aegis, Resistance, and of course, Stability. To the best of my knowledge, this preview stream has been the first explicit confirmation from ArenaNet that this is their vision for Chronomancer as well, and many of the preview changes are an effort to improve its overall support ability. Firebrand is not the king of the support meta right now because of its stability alone. Instead, it's that Firebrand has access to other defensive boons, powerful condition clears and resolve, group stun breaks, and decent healing output. So if other professions are going to be an alternative, they'll need a similarly versatile support kit. Chronomancer already has some of this with tools like Illusion of Life, but it's received more targeted changes in this preview. There are a lot of changes here, so I'm going to put them up on screen quick, and you can pause the video here if you want to read them all. After that, we'll cover some of the major changes. As a result of these changes, Chronomancer will have improved access to sharing protection, regeneration, and stability to its allies, and will also share Chaos Armor, which grants random boons to allies and random conditions to enemies when struck. The changes to stability are significant enough that Chronomancer can probably generate more stability and protection than a Firebrand, but probably not quite as much resistance and Aegis. But as we said previously, boon access alone isn't enough, so what else is Chronomancer getting for its support kit? Again, there's going to be a lot of lines here, so I'm going to put them up on screen, you can pause if you want to read, and then we'll survey the big changes. Changes here that really stand out to me as things that chip away at Firebrand's versatility as a support class are the resistance and group stun break on distortion that you get from mental defense. In no world is this going to be better than Mantra of Liberation as a stun break, just by virtue of the cooldown of these two abilities, but on-demand group resistance that isn't tied to a ground-placed field like Firebrand's Courage 4 is extremely valuable, especially with the stun break tacked on. Oftentimes, if you're going to stun break an ally, you'll also want to give them resistance, so that they're not immediately caught by an mob while trying to make it back to a group. Also interesting is the ability to purge conditions from allies by summoning a Phantasm with Sympathetic Visage, as this turns many of your Chronomancer skills and Mesmer skills into condition clears, or from using any of your Shatters with Restorative Illusions. And this also provides a heal to allies anytime you summon an illusion, which is a clone or a Phantasm. Now, do these changes go far enough to make Chronomancer a per-party support profession in World vs. World? I don't think so, but it's pretty close. Tome of Resolve and Firebrand's weapon skills are still exceptionally powerful healing and condition removal tools, and I don't think any of these changes are going to make inroads on that, unless they're tuned between now and the balance patch. But on the other hand, I don't think you wind up with a healthy meta if you just make Chronomancer a stronger version of Firebrand. It may actually be interesting if Firebrand winds up as a jack-of-all-trades support, while professions like Chronomancer are better for defensive boon uptime, and professions like Tempest or Vindicator are better for raw healing and condition cleanse. That's an interesting choice for squads to make, provided that ArenaNet can get the numbers right, and I'll be looking forward to at least trying to make it work on November 28th if all of these changes go live. Assuming nothing in these notes changes between now and then, support Chronomancer will probably use Chaos and Inspiration as straight lines, but there's a lot of flexibility and choice around which traits and utility skills are going to best fit a specific group, and I'm looking forward to testing a lot of combinations of them. Speaking of getting numbers right though, let's also talk about Scrapper. who's been on a bit of a roller coaster lately as far as balance is concerned. In my opinion, Scrapper was probably nerfed a little too aggressively over the course of the last year or so, and it's nice to see that these preview changes acknowledge that, and are looking to actively retune the profession to get a bit of that old power back. Scrapper has the opposite problem that Chronomancer does. Rather than competing with Firebrand as a defensive boon support, it's competing with Vindicator, Tempest, and Druid for healing and cleanse support. But I don't really see these changes doing too much to help Scrapper's case overall against this competition. You have more stability from mass momentum, and you hit more people with it, but mass momentum competes with gyroscopic acceleration, which is the trait that adds super speed to all of your gyros. And super speed has traditionally been one of the things that Scrapper has access to that differentiates it from other support professions in that role. There's a few minor changes here, like sharing barrier from System Shocker, and slight healing increases from rapid regeneration, but these aren't substantial enough changes to justify running Scrapper instead of more established support options in the healing and condition cleanse role, and it's likely that Scrapper is going to continue to try and find what its support identity is in the upcoming balance patches, because these changes don't currently address that issue. Moving on to damage profession changes, and this is going to be a little shorter than support, because there's not quite as many substantial changes here. Even with the nerfs to Arctivider in the balance patch earlier this month, Berserker remains king of the meta, and if anything, the previewed changes may end up being a slight buff to the profession overall. That said, I like the change to Smash Brawler a lot, as it means that Berserkers who don't press their buttons very well are going to spend less time in Berserk, while very skilled Berserkers will probably be able to extend the duration of Berserk by an additional second or two. When a trait change widens the gap between lower and higher skilled players, I'm generally in favor of those types of changes, because they make the game more interesting and reward good play. Heat the Soul losing its internal cooldown is also a nice buff, and should increase the amount of fury and might that Berserkers are able to generate for their party, should they choose to trait for it. The change to Heightened Focus is also pretty interesting, but I think it's still going to be hard to justify taking it over Burst Mastery, and the same goes for the talents and arms that have changed. They aren't going to be better than current versions of Berserker, and probably shouldn't be with how strong Berserker is right now. And that's really all there is to it for changes to damage professions in the current patch preview. So with that finished, let's move on to talking about the Relic changes and additions. In the Relic video that I did last month, I claimed that Relic of the Monk and Relic of the Herald were trap relics. They looked good on the surface, but in practice were too difficult to use effectively. Not impossible, but much more difficult than they looked on the surface. A major reason for that is because they had internal cooldowns on top of a narrow window for the stacks falling off completely. In the patch preview, this internal cooldown will be going away, and that immediately makes these two relics more viable options for an average player. Relic of Water is also getting buffed to increase the number of conditions removed, and Relic of Resistance has also been buffed to share resistance to allies nearby. All this to say, most support professions are now spoiled for choice in terms of relic options, with at least half a dozen good options, if not more, depending on what your specific squad comps for. And this is before we get to new relics that have been previewed, like Relic of Phoebe, which gives swiftness and clears movement impairing conditions on heal. To me, this feels like a good series of balancing changes to make the relic choice feel more interesting and meaningful for support professions. For damage professions, unfortunately, good options look harder to come by. The previews provide some options that may be valuable, with Relic of Nuris granting a number of effects when removing boons, and Relic of the Demon Queen improving the effectiveness of poison on enemies. But damage professions generally choose between Isgarin, Thief, Fireworks, and Speed, and the previewed relics have relatively narrow applications. Not every damage profession removes boons or applies significant quantities of poison, so their overall impact to me feels like it will be somewhat limited. That said, if any of these relics was going to be most utilized in World vs. World, it will definitely be Relic of the Demon Queen, so keep an eye on that one as we get closer to the release date of the patch. That wraps up everything that was previewed for the upcoming balance patch, so I want to use this last little bit of video to discuss some things that weren't mentioned, and make a few predictions for World vs. World once these changes go live. And I think the best place to start is addressing the two elephants in the room, Barrier Scourge and Berserker's Arctivider. These two professions, for the last 2 months, have been in an arms race. Arctivider provides exceptionally high spike damage, and Barrier Scourge mitigates this spike damage by generating large amounts of barrier for its party. As a result, these two builds are starting to warp the meta a bit, with groups running more Berserkers to overpower Barrier, and other groups running more Scourges to out-tank Arctivider. Neither of those builds are going anywhere in this patch, And while I personally think that neither build is too much of a problem in open field world versus world fights, I can recognize that the meta has coalesced around them, and that they're problematic in other world versus world game modes like GVGs. Regular viewers of the channel will know that I'm generally an optimist about all things world versus world, but I do think it would be interesting if ArenaNet took a more aggressive balancing stance towards builds that become too prevalent in a given meta. So for these two professions, what might those balance changes look like? Well, for Berserker, the core problem is high spike damage. Arc Divider, in my mind, is tuned appropriately, maybe a little strong, but being able to double cast it with Blood Reckoning is too much damage to deal with in too short a window of time. Were I on the balance team, I'd remove the Primal Burst recharge from Blood Reckoning, and I'd have it be the recharge condition for the rework of Heightened Focus. This means that Berserker would have to choose in its traits between regenerating Adrenaline off of a Primal Burst skill, but waiting for the cooldown to refresh, or being able to use 2 Primal Burst skills at once if you're able to immediately refill your Adrenaline with other utility skills. This, in my mind, is an interesting choice to make from a build perspective, and adds additional conditions to double casting your Primal Burst skill, flattening the damage profile overall. Barrier Scourge is a bit easier. The most problematic element of the profession is the amount of barrier that it generates, and modifying the healing power to barrier coefficient is probably sufficient to 2 down the build to a level where it's more in line with other support options. If you wanted to get more creative with balancing, you could instead reduce the amount of time that barrier lasts when applied to an ally, to make the timing of your barrier skill usage more impactful, and give groups more interesting decisions to make when fighting. And for anyone who's pessimistic about these two professions not going anywhere, it's still possible that ArenaNet could apply tuning to them between now and the patch. There's still a month to collect feedback and discuss some of the problems with the current meta. As far as predictions based off of what ArenaNet has said they intend to do, despite the fact that in this video I said that Chronomancer will probably not be good enough to replace Firebrand, I want to make the prediction that I'm wrong, and Chronomancer will actually be good enough to function as a per-party support profession as a result of these changes. And that's mostly because Firebrand is the oldest, most established element of a world versus world squad, and I think it would be really interesting to have more build flexibility and diversity in that slot. Now, is that a bit of wishful thinking? In the short term, next month, maybe, but I don't think it's that far off if ArenaNet continues their pattern of changing support Chronomancer to fill this role. Anyway, for now, that's all I've got for you. These patch preview videos are always interesting to make, but their timing is a pain to get right. So if you want to see more of them, it's even more important than for a usual video to like and leave a comment to let me know that you appreciate them. If you want to get notifications when I release new videos in the future, you can subscribe to the channel. And if you want to get more involved in overall discussions about patch previews, balance, or anything about World vs. World in general, you can join the Discord or stop by my Twitch stream sometime. Links in the video description. But until then, I've been Chef, and enjoy the rest of your day.